You'll see that okay?
Yep.
All right. So I already have this downloaded, but let's see if this like will let me do it. So when you go to that link, it doesn't matter what browser you use, should just be able to click that and you'll get this little setup thing. It shows up down here. And depending on your setup, it should automatically open. I think I have that turned off on mine, so I'm gonna double click it. And it's gonna ask me to accept the terms. If you wanna read it, you're welcome to it. I'm not gonna. And then I'm gonna do create desktop icon. This is gonna put it on my desktop so it's easier to find. And I'm gonna leave the rest of this set to whatever it already had selected. Hit next, install. Maybe I didn't have this installed because it's already doing it. Cool. And finish. And it should just automatically open. Perfect. It worked. We don't need this. Oh, that's a screenshot. I thought this was an actual dialogue. I was like, what is it asking? But yeah, once this opens, if you click on the in the chat to the file that I uploaded, let's try this. I'm gonna do it on here and see if it works. Oops, no, it's gonna try it on my Mac. But if you click that and unzip it, it should allow you to place it anywhere on your machine, either on your desktop or it'll be in the downloads folder. And then all you have to do, I'm just going to copy it. Right here. And I didn't clean this desktop, so it's probably really messy. I did on my Mac side, so it wouldn't look so bad. So if you not double click. I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to hit extract all. And it's going to ask me where I want to put it. I'm going to put it on my desktop. And now I should have this cat website folder. You probably won't have this Mac one. I don't know if that'll show up for you. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code. I'm going to hit open folder. And I'm going to go find my cat, it should say cat website. Select folder and ta-da, everything opens. So let me know if that does not work for anyone. But this will be kind of where we start from today.
So I think we're probably ready to get started. Hopefully more people will just come in over time.
Perfect. We can go ahead and we'll be recording so they can always watch it later. Okay, well, if you just downloaded that, here's the nice version of what we're going to be doing today with CSS. Last week we kind of went over our time, and so we didn't get to the part where we learned how to build a form. So we're going to actually do that right now. I'm going to get rid of this little hood because it's a little comfortable. So we'll start there and then we'll dive right into CSS. But the site that we did last week, let me go and open my version of that. To see your website, all you'll have to do is go in, let me do it on this side for those of y'all on Windows. Go to that cat website folder you were looking at. Click on index.html. We're going to right click and we're going to do open with Chrome. It should open up. Yay, and there it is. It's not very pretty. I'm going to check it out on my Mac side and continue working from this side. If I can read. Okay, so yeah, not very pretty. Interesting enough, if any of you notice that the way it displays this typeface here, it actually is very different on Windows because each browser has its own, and each platform, Windows versus Mac, has its own substitute that it will use for fonts. And obviously on the Windows side, it is using like a Comic Sans type thing. But we'll get more into how we customize that when we get to talking about CSS. Right now, what we're going to do is build a form. So last week we talked about some kind of tips and tricks for quickly creating pages. And so what we're going to do is in the cat website folder, you'll see this little new file icon. We're going to click on that and we're going to make a contact page. So we're going to call this contact us. And then we're going to put our file extension, which is HTML. So .html. And hopefully those of you who weren't here last week got to watch some of the video because I'm going to move kind of fast through some of the stuff we already covered just for the sake of time. But what I like to start out with for my page itself is take my home page, for example, and I think I didn't finish updating this. I'm going to copy it from another one. Oops. So that I have all that. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this, and I'm going to paste it into my Contact Us file. The reason I'm doing this is there are a lot of elements, a lot of code that's here that's the same on every page. And so by doing this, I'm saving myself a lot of time. So now that I've done that, I am going to go ahead and find the main elements. This is the kind of the content of the page itself. And I'm going to just go ahead and inside of that, I'm going to remove everything that was on the home page. So now I should just have my body, my head, main, nav, and footer on the page. This gives me kind of a blank canvas to work from. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Remember, always save your work as you're going. You'll see my stuff kind of format as I do that. And we're going to go to the page and see what it looks like. Like that. Fun. You'll notice I have some more links in my footer now. I added these for the styling portion today. If you want to add some more stuff to your footer, you can put whatever you want in there. We're going to be styling it later and making it look like an actual website footer and not like this icky line of text. So let's start with our contact page. So the one thing we always want to have on a page is the page title. We have that in two places, in our head with our title element here. I'm going to go ahead and kind of swap this out and make this half say cat rescue, and this half is going to be the name of the page. So contact us. Oops, contact is. There we go. And then we're also going to have our H1, heading level 1, that repeats the title of the page. This is the one that we can see. This is the one that search engines can see in screen readers. So we got to put one that people can see. So H1, contact us. And I'm going to want this to look a little nicer because if I save this right now, you're just going to see a heading floating way over here, icky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap some divs around this. And I'm looking over here at my cheat sheet for what I worked on earlier. All right, so the first div I'm going to put around my heading here. I'm going to put a class on it, which we'll be learning what that is today. And what this will do is, because you've downloaded the style sheet that I created, this should look a lot nicer after we add this class. We're going to learn how that works in a little bit. But I wanted to do that just so that while you're working, you don't have a site that looks super weird and doesn't make sense. All right, inside of that, we're going to go ahead and put another div. And remember, divs are just containers. They're just used for styling and positioning. I'm going to put my header inside that. So now I should have on line 41 header wrapped in some divs. All right, let's save that and let's go take a look. It should look a lot nicer now. Yay, now it's centered under our content area. It's not like floating off on its own. All right, so we got a page title. That's super important. The next thing I'm going to want to add is some information about how someone could actually contact us. One thing to keep in mind, I'm going to be adding fake information, fake contact information. When building out anything online, especially, you know, us as women being more vulnerable, or anyone under the age of 18 is typically more vulnerable to predators online. So we want to make sure that we don't put any personal information on our website that would allow someone to find us or contact us or send us anything weird. So whenever you're building out a contact page or anything for your own project going forward, really think about what you're putting on the site before you do, because it's out there. Anyone could see it, even if there are people we don't want to see it. So building a contact page, I'm not going to put my phone number on here because I don't want weirdos to call me. So I'm going to put a fake one, but if I was a cat rescue, I would likely have a business phone number and email and things that were not associated with me personally that were just for that. So that kind of gives me a little anonymity between, you know, like, so people can't just know who I am and reach out. So I'm going to create a new section for this under my div that says page intro. And I'm going to use another div. And this one, I'm going to give it the class content block. You'll notice I am not using spaces here in my classes. We'll talk about why that is. But what I'm doing when I have a capital letter here where there would normally be a space is something called camel case. And this is the way that we show where a space would normally be or help make it easier to read our code. And this is very common for web development. I'm going to also add another class to this. The way I do that is hit space and just tack it right on. All right, so I got my second div. And inside this, I'm going to use one of our sectioning elements that we learned about last week. And this one is called section, oddly enough. And this is going to tell the browser and assistive technologies that these things are grouped together. So you should treat them as such. So these things are all related. So we're going to add another heading for this section. And since I've already used an H1, I'm now going to use an H2. And I'm going to put call us because I want them to call me about rescuing cats. And so I'm going to put a paragraph, which is a P tag. And inside that, I'm going to add a phone number. To do a phone number, I don't know how many of you notice if you pull up a website on your phone, a lot of times phone numbers will look like a link, like something you can click on. And if you do click on them, it'll initiate a phone call. We want to make sure that our link does that too, or that our phone link does that too. So we're going to make it an actual link, so an anchor tag, which if we remember from last week, that starts with an A, href equals, and then we're going to leave this blank for now and finish this out. See how it completed for me. And I'm going to put in a random phone number. I'm going to do like some 5s. No one, we'll call that. And then I'm going to go back to my href. And there are, we talked about last week how we would just put a URL in here. But since this is a phone number, we have to treat it a little differently. So we have to tell the browser that it's not a normal link, it's a phone number link. And we do this by putting tell. From there, we're going to add a colon. And then we're going to do a plus. This is basically defining the country code. And then we're going to do a 1 and then our phone number. So we did 555 555 55555. And we're going to save it. So this has now set this up to be a phone number. We also, if we wanted to do an email, I'm not going to put that on this site because we're about to build a form. But to do that, I just copied this so we could duplicate it. We would actually put mail to : so telephone is tell, email is mail to, and then we would do, Bekah@truematter.com. And if someone clicked on this link, which would say email or my email address, it would open up their preferred mail application on their phone or on their computer, and it would start an email to me. So we do these kind of things because it makes it easier for our user who's on our site to do these tasks very quickly. It's kind of a nice just convenience. All right, so we added the phone number. Now we want to give our users the option to send us a message. So I'm going to do another H2. I'm going to put send a message because I want to make sure I give everything on this page a good heading that's very descriptive of what I'm asking the person to do or what they're about to read about. All right, so now that we've got kind of some basic content, I'm going to save this so we can see it. Yay, not very pretty, but it's there. All right, let's start our form. So forms, we're only going to get into the HTML side of them today. Hopefully when you guys get into JavaScript, they'll help you kind of fill this out and make it actually work. What we're doing now will not actually send any messages. There's not going to be any connection to the kind of back and forth aspect. It's just going to display it on the page. Saying all that, you can't build a form without HTML if you're working on a website in HTML. So this part is necessary. So to start our form, we're going to use a form tag. And this is one of those easy tags that makes sense and is the name of what it is. And then within that, we're going to make our first kind of block of a form control. Typically for, say, what's a text field where I just enter plain text, we have a label which says what the field is for, and then the field. This is a very common pattern. And the reason for the labeling, which I'll show you, is because if someone visually can't see the page, and they're using a screen reader, for example, we can associate. So I'm going to go ahead and just put one in here, make this easier. So label, actually, I'm going to put this in a div so it looks nicer, just so we can group our controls. And I'll go into what is in this, all in this label here. the different attributes we're going to add in a second. But for now, I'm just going to put this so we can see it. Oops, sorry. Type text ID. Yay, so this pattern, as I was mentioning, is a lot easier to show than to just use my hands. I visually can tell that this label goes with this field because they're close together. That's the law of proximity. But if I couldn't see and I was using a screen reader, this would get read to me. And that can be very confusing, especially with forms, because the way a screen reader reads forms is based on the code. It's not based on proximity or things that are close together, none of that. The visual aspects of it are completely stripped away. So to a screen reader, this control here, this text box, doesn't have a name. It doesn't have anything on the code side that tells the screen reader what it is or what it's for. We visually can see this and say, oh, well, it's for first name or whatever this label would say. But the screen reader can't. So we have to add special attributes to our form elements to make sure that the screen reader can understand what these are for. And therefore, anyone using a screen reader can understand what they're for. So we had our label here. I'm actually going to make this a real thing. It's going to be first name. So we want to know the name of the person that's contacting us. And we're going to add an attribute that's specific to label here. That is the for attribute. So for equals, and then we're going to give it a name. I already kind of added this. I should have probably slowed my roll there. But I added this thing here, an attribute called ID, to my input. And I want that ID, this input here, to be associated with this label. So I'm just going to reuse it and say fname, so first name, is what this label is for. When I'm adding a form control, I'll just kind of remove this and start over. Depending on what it is, we're always going to start with input, because that's what the user is doing from the computer side. You're inputting information. And then I'm going to say what kind it is. So the attribute for that is type. And there are several options. You can see it's actually kind of trying to give me some suggestions here, because Visual Studio Code is awesome. And there are a lot of options for the type of input this could be. We're just doing someone's name. So we're just going to say text, because that's all we want them to be able to enter. And it will make sure that that's the case. The next thing we're going to do is add an ID. This is a unique identifier for our control. IDs we'll learn more about in CSS. But they are truly unique to that element. So this element on line 52 is the only element that should have the ID fname. I should never repeat these anywhere else because then they're no longer unique. They're no longer identifying a specific element. They're really just confusing the browser and assistive technologies. So they should always be used one time per page. All right, and then we're also going to add a name. And this is kind of confusing because a lot of people think, oh, the name, that's basically the label. It should be first name. The name could be actually be whatever you want. It doesn't matter what you put here. The name is used for other parts of building a form that aren't related to HTML. So hopefully I'll cover some of that once you make this form actually work, whereas right now it's just going to be on the page. So just to keep it simple, I'm going to set this to first name. All right, so I have my first form field. If I save that, I should see first name and a text box. Yay, I can enter basically whatever I want there. All right, so let's add some other ones. So another thing we might want, we got their first name, we might want their last name. Big part of coding is not having to type a bunch of stuff. So I'm just gonna copy this here, paste it, oops. And change this to last name. Instead of for F name, it's going to be L name, and the ID will be L name, and my name will be last name. So it's a lot quicker than if I retyped all that out again. Let's add, let's see, I'm trying to think of other things. Maybe an email. We'd want their email, right? So that we can message them back. So again, going to paste that same last name div with all of my label and my input. And then I'm going to change it out. So this one will be for email. That's what I'm going to call my control below. Oops. And I'm going to put the type as email. And this will make sure that on the browser side, and when I make this form actually work later, that it's only accepting an email and not text. So it's kind of being more specific than just saying, oh, it's just text with an @ symbol. And then my ID is going to be email and my name is going to be email. And I wish I got notifications when people chat, but they don't. Okay, I just need to keep this over here. So now we have an email. One thing that we want to keep in mind with designing forms is that some of this information we're going to allow to be optional. The user can put it in or they could just skip it. And some of it we're going to force them, say, you have to put this in before you submit it. Otherwise, what was the point of you filling out this form? Email, in my mind, is one of the ones that I definitely want. If someone's going to message me, I want to be able to message them back. So I'm going to add an attribute to this input, and it's just required. You don't have to set it to true or false or do anything like that. You just type the word required. And what this does is it tells the browser and the form as a whole that this field has to have a value in it or they cannot submit the form. They can't send it, to you. So to be nice to my user, they can't see this. So I want to make sure that I convey to them that this is required. There are a lot of ways to do this, but I think being straightforward is the best way to go. I don't want to make the person sending me a message have to think too hard. So I'm just going to add a span in here. If you remember from last week, a span is like a div. It means nothing. It's just a container. And inside that, in parentheses, I'm going to put required. And now my user will know that they have to enter their email or this form is not going to work. All right, let's add a new thing for, I guess, maybe the subject of the message. So what they actually want to send us. I don't really like the word subject. I'm going to call it message. And again, we got to change all our attributes. So we're going to do the text, the ID, and the name. Oops, why did I type name? I was saying the word name and I just typed it. That should be message. Sorry, guys. All right, I'm going to save that. Let's see what our form looks like. Yay, we've got a bunch of fields. So I guess looking at this, that's probably not enough space for a message unless they're just going to send me one sentence. So we're going to use something other than a typical input. We're going to use a text area. And that's basically just a bigger, you've seen these in forms, kind of a bigger little window section thing where people could put a nice paragraph or a book about something. And all we do for that is put text area instead of input. And then unlike an input, I don't know if any of you noticed, there's no closing tag here. There's no slash at the end. It's just kind of different. I'm not sure why that is. Whoever, designed HTML just wanted to throw us for a loop. So text area is like your typical HTML element. It does have a closing tag, and it's just text area. So it should auto-populate that for you. All right, so now this should be tall, yay. So that's a lot more space. Someone can enter a nice little message there. All right, so we have our form. It's pretty simple and straightforward, but we got to give them a way to submit it, to actually send it. So that usually means we need a button. So I'm going to create another div, just like we did for all our other form controls, and I'm going to put in an input. So there are several ways you could do this, and when you get into JavaScript, I'll talk about the different elements that you could use here. From an accessibility standpoint, which for those of you that remember, that's making our website accessible. I mean, that's really the only word. Like someone can actually get to it, consume the content, regardless of the device they're using, the browser, the computer type, what have you, or their disability. This could also be things like I'm in a dark room and my browser or my monitor is really dim and I can't see well. So we always have to think about the situation someone might be in. So it might not always be like I'm blind, I'm using screen reader. It could be I have a migraine, or I didn't wear my glasses today and I can't see the screen. So we want to think about those things whenever we're coding. So here, I'm going to actually use the most traditional way to submit a form, and that's by using an input, just like we did above. But this one, the type is going to be submit. And the value, which is another attribute we were going to use here, is going to be submit. So this is what we traditionally have always used for forms, but there are other ways to do this. Another way would be to use a button, right? Which you notice that closes itself. And then if we were going to use JavaScript, which you guys will get into this, we would tie the submitting of the form, like tell it to send when this is clicked by using what's called an event. And that would look something like this. And then, so y'all will get into that probably in JavaScript, but these are the two main ways I could submit my form. We're going to stick with the traditional route because we're just now learning and we want to do everything kind of basic and, you know, save getting into the weeds for later. All right, so we have our form and it should have a button at the bottom. Yay. It's not very pretty, but we'll get there. All right, so we want to finish out the rest of our contact page. So I'm going to make another section because having a form on here is great, but what if the person visiting the site actually wants to like come to the cat rescue and like see the cats or come volunteer? We want to make sure that we also include our location. So I'm going to add another H2 and call that our location. And I'm going to just put a paragraph with the address in it. So I want my address to be formatted the way it typically is in the US, where we have the street address, the city, state, and zip code. So I'm going to put the street address in a span. Remember, these are just containers that allow us to style things. And I'm going to put the address of my office, just so I have something there. And then I'm going to do, after that span, just put the city, state, and zip code. All right, so it should look something like that. And if I save this, oh, look, it showed up over there. I wonder how. We'll go over that in a minute. It's magic. So now I have my address. It's all one line. When we get into CSS, you'll see how we can make it not one line. But to be extra nice, I want to make this a link. So if someone wants to like use Google Maps, they could just click on this and it'll go to that location in Google Maps. So I'm going to wrap this span and the rest of the address in a link. See, it filled it or finished it out for me. All right, and I guess I need to look up this address. So the way I would do this, all right, that's in the way. I guess I could have just typed the address in there. There it is. All right, and then I'm going to do share. And it's going to give me this nice short little URL. Oh, actually, I guess I should do directions and then share. I wonder if that'll give me a better option. No, we'll just share the address and then they can click the directions button when it comes up. It's just going to give me a nice short little link. I'm going to go back to my code and paste that in. And now that should make this, oops, wrong cat rescue. Yay, it should make it a nice little link. And you see it formatted it onto the second line. That was because of the style sheet that I gave you guys. All right, so we've added a link to it. How about we add the actual map itself? That'd be cool. So I'm gonna go back to Google Maps. Oh, it was already open. If you hit share, it'll give you the option to embed the map. And what this is an iframe. These are kind of used less and less. I feel like they're kind of on their way out. There are better ways to do some of this in HTML5, but it works perfect for our purposes. What it is it's almost like you could think of it as a window into another website that you're placing on your website. So it has its own body, its own head. All the things that we have on our website are also going to be displayed inside this iframe. So I'm going to go back to my markup and I'm just going to paste that in. Ooh, it's long. All right, and it should show us a little map. Yay, look how nice that is. All right, great. So we have a contact page. Last week we created our mission page and we have a home page. I think we have a pretty good start on a site. So unless there are any questions from you guys or anyone needs like to pause to finish typing stuff, I say we dive into CSS. Yeah? All good? Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention that at the beginning. The chat is really helpful for that. I try to like check it as often as I can, but if it takes me a minute, I do apologize. The window kind of hides itself sometimes. All right, so I'm going to pull up my slide deck and we're going to start talking about CSS and then we'll actually start making some. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Styles is what this has always been called, the actual making your content look nice. But it used to be that we would do styles in our HTML at some point. That was how this got started. And you would add them just like you do any of these other attributes. So let's say, for example, on my heading, on that contact us page, I would use the style attributes equals, and then I'd put some CSS in there. And that's fine and good, you know, you can do that, but it gets a little unwieldy after a while because you have in each file all these different styles. You have to keep track of them and figure out where you did something. It's just very messy, and not a good practice. So we created style sheets, which are just large versions of our styling in a single document that we link to in the head of our HTML. And it pulls in all those styles and connects them with the classes and the elements we've used to kind of make things look nicer. So I think I basically just stated what I put here. But if HTML is the skeleton, so to speak, CSS is like the skin and things that make the skeleton not gross looking. So it's very important, so much so that if we got rid of our CSS altogether, I showed this last week, but just as a reminder of how great it is, I'm gonna go to my other one here. Refresh this. Ew, not great. So this is completely without my styles and the styles that I sent you guys. But you'll notice that it's still like looks okay. It doesn't look like just random text all strung together. And the reason for that is that all browsers actually have a built-in style sheet that is used when no style sheet is available to make things look the way you see here. It's different depending on the browser you're using. But if you remember last week, I showed you guys the inspector where I just right click or select something, right click on it and hit inspect. And it shows me that exact same thing over here in HTML, but also down here, it shows me the styles. So you notice this says user agent style sheet. That is basically telling me that's the styles that the browser has come up with. So anytime we are doing CSS, this is really helpful to know because unless I style this element, so unless I style the H1, it's going to look like this. So if I don't override all of these properties here with my own CSS, it's going to inherit what the browser has determined. So a lot of times we'll think, oh, that heading should be like green. Why is it not green? And by using this little style pane here, we can see what we did and then what the browser's doing. And it allows us to kind of figure out where we went wrong. So I'm going to add our styles back because this looks icky. Much better. And so this is the version of the cat rescue site with lots of CSS, a lot more than what we had. We've got like some animations. We've got, you know, a nice little header and some more formatting type stuff. And so that's what we are going to be doing today. So the benefits of using CSS, especially for using a dedicated style sheet that we link to in the head, is that it's a lot faster. It downloads a lot faster. It's more compact. We don't have to type a bunch of stuff like we did with the inline styles and keep track of it. And if we want to update something, like say we want to make all headings yellow, don't know why we do that. We do it in one place as opposed to going to every single HTML file and having to update it. So they're great. Style sheets are awesome. To add one, we kind of did this last week. We actually add it in the head and we use our link element and we just link to it within our project. So all of you should have this in the head of each of your pages that we built so far. We just called it style.css, oops, but you can call it whatever you want. You also, later we'll be adding style sheets for fonts and for some icons, which are pretty fun. So any HTML document can have as many style sheets as you want. This is completely up to you. And on each page, you could use different style sheets. So I could have my home page, you know, look one way, and then I could have the contact page, you know, look completely different, like a different site. I probably wouldn't want to do that because it might confuse the user who's like, where am I? What happened? But you could, you have all of those options. So CSS is made up of sorry, I keep touching the mouse, is made up of a very different syntax than HTML. It looks very different, but some of the basics are kind of similar. You know, in HTML, we have elements which are, things like headings, paragraphs, lists, divs are an element too. In CSS, elements are translated to what we call a selector. And selectors can be several different things. Which I'll show in a minute. But at the end of the day, it's just an identifier. It's just a way for the CSS to match up with what's in our HTML and marry the two so that we see things with the right styling. Within our selector, so we always open our selector with a curly bracket, that's what I call them, and close them with a curly bracket. Visual Studio Code will do that for you automatically, so that's great. Inside our selector, we have properties, just like we have attributes on HTML, we have properties in CSS. And each property has a value. So an example of a property could be color, and the value could be orange. And we always state our property with a colon, our value, and then a semicolon. And this tells the browser that this is what I want to change, this is what I want to change it to, done. And then it goes to the next one. Some examples of, I guess I just restated that too. So always curly, not square braces. And the selector can be the actual element itself. So this could say section, which is an HTML element, or form. It could also be a class, which you saw, we added those classes in a few places where I put the attribute class and then set its value to something I just made up arbitrarily. Or it could be an ID. We added some IDs to our form inputs. And those are unique to that input. So if we're trying to target something as like a one case instance, I want only this heading to be green, I would use an ID because it's very unique to that instance. So here are more examples of the selectors and how they're used and translated from HTML to CSS. An H1 element is just an H1 selector. Paragraph element is a paragraph selector. We have a class. So if we had a div, we always put classes on divs for the most part because they're just a container without a name can't do a whole lot. So if this div was called awesome, I would put a period in front of it stating that this is a class. It's just kind of like a reminder to the browser of what this is. And the class is awesome. I can also add classes to inline elements. If you remember from last week, there are block elements, which take up a whole line and are kind of like a parent or container. And then there are inline elements, which don't take up a whole line and can be nested inside of block elements. And then with IDs, we added an ID to form controls, but we can actually add those to any HTML element, block or inline, doesn't matter. And in CSS, we state that it's an ID by putting the pound symbol or a hash in front of it. Here's just kind of an overview of what each of these is with the names. I added a lot more to these slides than the HTML because I think these are really helpful after the fact. Once you forget everything we talked about, you can go back and look at these. But basically, when we're using an element as our selector, we're really stating something that should be very high level and global to our site because we're saying, I want all paragraphs to look this way because it's not specific, right? It's just those elements. When we're using a class, we're getting more specific, but we might be saying, I want all paragraphs inside this div that have this class on them to look a certain way. Or I want just this paragraph to look a certain way. You could use a class one time on one element and that's fine. But usually it's better to use an ID in those cases because it's really truly a unique style for a unique element. All right, so let's add some classes. We've actually already done this because I didn't want you guys to be coding something that looked super icky. So you'll notice throughout I have some classes in here. And if we look at our style sheet, they should all be the same because I sent you guys this. You'll see that I'm doing a combination of things in here. I've got an element selector. I've got a class selector. And I don't think I have an ID in here yet, but we'll add one. And then within each of those, I state a couple things, properties, values that I want to do. But what happens if I have, let's say here, I have some things that are nested. So if I wanted to target this div and do something to it, obviously I could use those classes. But what if I want to target this H1 and I don't want to add a class to it because there are lots of H1s on this site? What I could do is tell the CSS And I've got some examples here. I think this is actually for the navigation. I tried to add some comments where I state what the parent element is, and then I follow it with something that's nested inside it. So here I'm saying within our nav, I want all of the links to look like this. And so it directly ties to the nav element, which had a class. I could have used that, but I was trying to just keep it very obvious. And then any link that's inside any link is going to look a certain way. If I wanted to say that it's just the link that is a direct child, I'm going to say parent and child a lot because that's how I typically think of it. You have, the main item and all these other things are inside it. So to me, that's the parent. These are the children. They're kind of underneath it. So if I want to directly associate two selectors together, let's say I had here, this was probably on our mission page. We had that page intro, right? I think that's what it said. Yeah, or we have intro. And I only want to target the direct child, the first div, so to speak, or first child here. Well, not the first. It's any div that is a child of intro and do this to it. That is another way you could do this. But here I'm not being very specific, so I also alternatively could have done this, and that would work just fine. So it really just depends on what you're trying to do. There's a lot of different, what we call operators that you can use for this. All right, back to the presentation. So we've added a lot of classes already, so I don't want to go into that. I think it's more important that we talk about the properties. Like HTML, the property names are often really obvious, and then sometimes they're just completely not obvious and don't make no sense. For example, when we're talking about fonts, we have all of these properties that start with fonts, so font family, font size, font weight. So what would you guess the property is for changing the color of a font or the color of some text? Naturally, I would think font color. Doesn't that make sense if all these other things start with font? But unfortunately, that's not the case. So it's actually just color. Anytime we want to change the color of text, this is only related to text, we have to use the color property. There are a few other ones that are kind of weird, like float. You're probably like, I don't know what the heck that means. You're right to think that. It actually has very little to do with any of the elements. It's more about positioning and where things show up. Sometimes instead of using, font, we'll see text something. So text alignment controls if something's left aligned, centered, or right aligned. Text decoration is used for underline or strike through, where you have the line through the text. And text transform. So there are a lot of different ones that the names kind of make it confusing, where it seems like they should all be the same. Like if it's text, it should always start with text. If it's font, that's not the case. So keep that in mind. A lot of times when you're writing CSS, you can kind of guess what the property would be. But sometimes it's a little more confusing than that. So colors are probably the first thing you're going to want to do, because having a site that's black and blue and white and that's it is kind of boring. Not to say that it could be made pretty. But when we want to add a color to something, we have two options. The first is to actually use the name of the color, but this is very limited. There are only so many colors defined by HTML and CSS, which we know is kind of a global thing created by some scientists in the early 90s, or late 80s. But we know, just from life, that there are infinite colors out there. Like you can combine colors to make new colors. There's shades and tints and all these things. And when they were creating CSS, they were not that creative about the colors. So there are some very basic ones like black, blue, white, but there's not a lot of subtleties to those colors. Like if you use red, it's going to be just this one kind of red. But as we know, there are a lot of shades, different ways, you can adjust a color. And so to do that, we have to use something a little more sophisticated, and that's what's called a hex value. So there are actually more than just the two ways, but we're going to focus on those because I think these other ways are a little hard to remember. But hex values are a series of numbers that control different aspects of the color. Basically, where it starts on the color wheel, how dark or lighter it is, how much contrast it has, saturation. All of that's factored into these values. And these are just some basic ones. So in HTML, all of these colors have a keyword. So black, white, red, blue. They always look like this. But if we wanted to use the hex value, it would translate to this. Hex values always start with the hash or pound symbol, and they're almost always 6 characters long. I say that sometimes they can be 3, but for the sake of today, we're just going to say they're 6. And y'all can dive into why they're sometimes 3 on your own time. And then, well, sometimes you'll see RBG values. This is red, green, blue, and it's defining the number within the color scale for what that would be for red, green, and blue, which we know most computer monitors, what you're seeing is made up of pixels, and those pixels are using red, green, and blue color light to convey colors to us. This is actually hue, saturation, and I want to say level, but I can't remember. I'll Google it later. But these are the 4 ways we could define a color. So if we're looking at this in the browser, we're going to use our inspector. And I think I like the inspector most for CSS. And so we're going to be using it a lot today because I think it's a really good teacher for understanding what's going on with our CSS. Another cool thing I haven't showed you guys is if you see this little line of our different elements here, this is showing the relationship, how these are nested. So within HTML, we have body. Within body, we have main. Within main, we have a div with intro row. That was the one I clicked on, I think. So let's click on a different one. Click on this one. Yeah. And then if I wanted to target something in that, I clicked on here. You now see it says within that div, there's an H1. Whatever is highlighted is the thing that you're seeing the styles for. And if I click on one of these other ones, I can change what I'm seeing the styles for. So right now, you're seeing the styles for this little pink box. If I hover over that, or I hover over it here, it's going to highlight it, which is really helpful. And so you see here, I set the background color for this box to be kind of this like weird salmony pink. But if I wanted to change that, there are a couple ways I could do this. I could put in a different color name. So you see when I cleared that out, it gave me a list. These are all the colors that have a key or a keyword that exists in CSS. Dark salmon, for example, is very similar to the color we had. So these are options that you could use. You could always go back and go through that list and pick things. But I personally like to, have a little more control over my colors. So I could, sometimes I memorize these black and white. I always know. I just can think of them off the top of my head because they're easy. There's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and F, 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 F. But there are other colors, out there. And the best way I find to find out what color something is, depending on what you're using, if you're designing your site visually in something like Photoshop or Illustrator, you can do that first. And then you can use a color picker to get the color out of it. But Chrome, and I'm going to refresh this real quick. Just checking the chat. Has a cool little built-in thing. Whereas if I click this little square where it's giving me a preview of the color, I get this little like color selector type deal, which is pretty neat. And anything that I adjust here will actually adjust in the browser. Anything I change actually in the inspector will be reflected in the browser, and that's super fun. We'll try this out with like Facebook or some other website. So you can see how cool it is to manipulate another site that's not yours, but it's not permanent. Anything you do in the inspector, visually you can see it, but it doesn't change anything for anyone else. All it's doing is changing the style sheet for whatever you're looking at locally on your computer. The way these pages work is whenever you're opening anything on the web, you're essentially downloading parts of it. That's why sometimes if you have a slow internet connection, it takes forever to get something to load. That's because you're having to download all those files. So here we've downloaded the style sheet because we opened this. And so I can manipulate it. But like I said, it's not permanent. So this is a cool way to kind of test things out. You'll see I slid this and I changed the opacity of my color, which is kind of neat. I can also change what it's using. So it was using hex. Now it's using RGB A. A is actually the opacity. So if I did 0.5, it'll make it a little less opaque. And then these are red, green, and blue. And then the SLA, there's A again for opacity. You can do that, but obviously we're using hex. One thing that is kind of neat is it's pulled all the colors from my site and kind of showing me what I've been using. I think that's kind of fun. And then I also can go completely different and be like, oh no, I want like a lime green theme and I want it to be kind of, dark, which makes it hard to read. I don't recommend doing that. So all of this you can do in the browser, and this is really helpful if you're trying to figure out, okay, I've got a site, but now how do I want it to look? You can use this tool to kind of play around, mess with the colors and see them in real time so you can try it out without actually having to go mess with your code and permanently change it. Another cool thing is this little eyedropper. Let's say I go to a website and I'm like, man, I like the colors they're using. Those look awesome. I can take this little eyedropper and go anywhere on the page. You'll see it kind of zooms in and select that color, and it will apply it to whatever I had selected, which was this div. And then if I, click something else, it changes. And so this I find really helpful because a lot of times I'll see a color like just on a page. It might even be in a picture. Like I might be like, oh man, this cat's eyes, what a pretty green. I can select it. It's going to give me the hex value, which is really helpful because in this case, I could copy this, go to my CSS and apply it. Or I could just see it in the browser and say, oh, actually that doesn't look as good as I thought it would. I liked the color I had before. So this is a super cool tool. Another thing that it will do if I select, so let's go deeper, I select text, right? And I don't think I've defined the color for that. I did for the link, so let's look at that. If I click on this, you'll see this thing that says contrast ratio. This only works for text on top of a background, so that has color. It will give me a check mark or an X, depending on the color I'm using. So here, for example, if I change my link color to be the same green as the background, you see it gave me a little kind of no symbol. What it's doing here is it is checking the ratio of the background to the foreground and telling me if it's easy to read, if it passes a certain threshold. For accessibility, there are a lot of people that obviously have low vision or vision-related disabilities, but there's also folks just that are colorblind and can't see certain colors. And they might need a higher contrast between the colors, the foreground and the background, to be able to see something. And so there is a ratio for this, and in the slide deck, there's a ton of links at the end that y'all can go look at this. But it's basically, if it's text that's around this size, it needs to be 4.5 to 1 ratio. So right now I'm at 1.85. That is definitely not good. So I'm going to select maybe, I don't know, let's try white. Ooh, way worse. Let's see, because I have a white button. So yeah, that makes sense. Let's do maybe this red. Yay. Oh, nope, still bad. Not good enough. All right, I'm going to go with black because I know that's probably going to be safe. Yay. And so it gives me 1 check mark if it meets what's called AA. These are accessibility requirements. It's called WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They're very not fun to read. Don't recommend it. It's very in-depth. But we want to always make sure that things we design meet AA contrast. AAA is nice if you can do it, but this usually is way more extreme, and you have to have like very high contrast between your colors. It's very hard to achieve. And it isn't really the standard. Most people go off. Ours is always kind of AA or single A. So just a little tidbit about that. So yeah, this is a fun way to figure out our colors. Probably spent too long on colors. I love color. So one of the things we could do with color is change the background. You saw that I did that here. And there are several different properties that are associated with background. We can use background color, which is pretty obvious. Oops. So if I click on that, I've got my, there we go. My background color was this random green I picked. If I wanted to set it another way, I could just state background. There's some shorthand in CSS. And I'm going to do white. All right, so you notice, weird thing, I had background color here, and then I put background, set a color, and it changed it. One of the things that's really important to know about CSS is that anything at the end or at the lower half of my CSS will override things that are higher up. So it goes from bottom up as far as the importance. So if I wanted my background to actually be green, I would need to make sure that this background color property came after background. So if I uncheck that to turn it off and I add a new one, I'm going to do background color. And then I don't remember what that green is, crimson. And you see that that overrid the white that I had there before. So anything that's at the bottom is going to override what you have at the top, unless you add a special little property to the end where you do exclamation mark important. And this will override anything regardless of order. And I actually shouldn't have done it there because that's a bad example. Let's do it on our green. And see, now the green is overriding the white because I've added important to it. So anytime you're like trying to apply styles and you're like, oh, why isn't this working? You can use important, but I encourage you to instead look at what you've done, look at your styles, and figure out, am I overriding something because I put it at the bottom instead of the top? So that is the background color. The other thing we can do is actually a background image, which is what we've done here with our little kitty cat. So I'm going to go to the ugly cat rescue site, which is what we were working on. It doesn't quite have all the same styles. And let's go to our style sheet. And we can clear some of this out and start fresh, but I feel like that's going to take a long time. So we're going to keep what we have and just kind of add on to it. I'm doing some basic things here with my HTML. That's, remember, our topmost element that tells the browser this is an HTML document. I'm doing some basic things like saying that I want the font size, whatever I define in the child elements, to be at 100%. If I were to change this to say 50, it will globally reduce the size of all my fonts. It's a teeny tiny. So we always want to set that at 100% if we want it to be accurate to what we intended the size to be. When we're using defining fonts, there are several different units that we can use. We can use pixels. We can use something that's called rem. We can use an M. There are lots of different options there. I won't go into them, but you're welcome to Google that if you want to know more. We're just going to use pixels because that's easy today. And so pixels are going to always define the size of something, whether it be the width, the height, the spacing, in this case, the font size. And so you'll see that in a lot of places here. Let's just first, I guess, look at background image. So I did this here on our intro, which was on the home page where that little cat image was. And I'm going to remove it because we don't want to cheat. And so right now, there is nothing there, right? And I want to add an image. So I'm going to put background, because remember, that's kind of like the shorthand. It combines all these different properties into one line as opposed to doing background image, position, and repeat. If we just use background, it combines them all together. So I'm first going to do the actual image itself. And I don't remember if that file path is on here, but okay. So to do that, I'm going to type URL and some parentheses, and inside that I'm going to put an image reference. So we don't have any images probably on here yet. So let's see. I don't know if I added that. Yeah, we've got, oh yeah, I have the cat image and we have the logo. I think this was the cat image we added to the mission page. So let's just try it out. I'm going to add my semicolon at the end and save that. And let's see what that does. Okay. I think that's our cat image. I think it's just a really big image. And so it's very hard to see it. It's probably like a piece of the image. All right, so let's add some more things so we can actually see it. So I mentioned background image is a part of this background property. The second part of it is, do I want the image to repeat? So here, if I had done cat logo, oops, which I think this is actually a PNG. Let's see. Oh, it's just logo. If I had done that, oh my gosh, lots of cats all over the place. By default, anytime you add a background image, the CSS is going to think you wanted to tile it and you wanted to make it like this. We don't want that, especially if we're going to use that cat image that I had typed in here before, because it's a really big image, so I'll likely never see where it's tiled. So we're going to just tell it to not repeat, no repeat. We're going to save that. And then if we were still had the logo, which I'll show you just for an example, you don't have to do this, it would only show it one time. So that's a lot better. So I'm going to change this back to our cat image. All right, so the next value we can add here to this background property, we told it not to repeat. Let's tell it where we want it to actually place it. So I want it to be centered inside of my container. Background images are always based on the container that they live in. So I'm going to do center. Oh, look, you can see part of the cat now. That's nice. So it's taking this giant image and essentially centering it in my div. And that's actually the top center here. We want to do so top bottom, and then we have right left. So that's kind of hard to remember, but if you get them backwards, you'll be able to tell pretty quickly. So I'm going to do center top. Let's see what that looks like. Oh, can't find my cat. All right, so let's go manipulate this in the browser just so we can start experimenting. Let's do, I don't know, top. some reason it didn't like that. Oh, that's why. I had it backwards. So this first one is actually the right to left. The second one is top to bottom. I had that backwards, I apologize. So let's put it back at center, and then let's go ahead and do center here also. So we should get like the most center point of the image from top to bottom, right to left. Good. It's still too big, right? It still looks crazy though. So let's go ahead. These are all the properties I can add to background. Let's go ahead though and do a new one, and we're gonna do background size. And we have a couple options here. We can actually do a pixel amount. So I could do 100 pixels. That looks bad. Or there are a couple keys. So a key is basically a property that's specific, or a value that's specific to this property. If you ever want to see all your options, a cool way to do that is go select the element you're working on. And then if you click on the value, so you notice when I clicked that, it automatically activated it, made it editable, and I hit backspace. I now get a list of everything that could go there. You see as I'm arrowing down on my keyboard, it's changing it to all these different options. So this is a great way to learn because it's very hard to remember all the options you have. So I find this really helpful. I'm going to hit contain, and what that's doing is it's going to try to fit the image to the container so that it's proportionally showing as much as possible and not extending beyond it. If I used, I think the other option was cover, it's just going to spread the image out to cover that area. And since this image is pretty big, it works pretty well. If I had a small image like logo, you see it tried to cover that whole space, but now my cat looks really bad. But if I did contain, it's going to make it a little bit better because now it's just stretching it to fit the size, but not to cover as much of it as possible. All right, so that's the background. That one I think is just really cool, so I wanted to spend a lot of time with it. If you didn't want to do the shorthand, this is the extended way just to show you. In the sake of time, I'm going to skip through some of these, unfortunately, because I think, actually we said that we would go, yeah, so we're going to 3:30 today instead of 2 or 3, I mean. So there are lots of different things you could change. And if you look through these slides, but also look through the styles that I've done in here, you'll see all kinds of examples of crazy stuff. For the sake of time, I'm going to walk through some of these slides that I feel like are a little more important, and we won't play around with as much of this. But what I would like for y'all to do is style your site, like make it completely unique. And I would love to, at some point, whenever you're happy with it, you know, send me a screenshot in Slack. I love seeing this kind of stuff. To me, it's really exciting. Adding fonts. This is a really cool one. And I included a link in here to go to Google Fonts. And the way that we add a font is super simple. We find one we like. So I think I used like this kind of pretty one for the header. I don't remember what it was called, but we're just going to pick a random one. I'm going to pick this brand standard. Click on it, and I think if we select a style, I want like this bold one. It's going to open up this little window over here, and it's going to show me several ways I can add it. We're going to add it as a link. So I'm going to copy this. Oops. Sorry, y'all are in the way over there, covering my thing. And then I'm going to go to the head of one of my HTML files. We'll have to do this in all 3 places, which I already added some here, but I'm going to go ahead and just paste that in, right? And that will go ahead and add a reference to the style sheet for this font. I'm going to change mine back to what I had because I'm going to have to update the styles. After I do that, then I would add this to every page, right? Because I want to be able to use it on every page. I would then go to my styles and find, let's see, I think I did this in the body. Yep. And I'm going to put font family, and then over here, it gives me this nice little cheat sheet. It gives me the name to use that's specifically tied to that style sheet. So if I wanted to use this font, I could copy that and add it here on the body, or I specifically could add it to one instance. So I think here I used, oh yeah, the header for my website, you know, is kind of that pretty font. That was a different one, so I defined it again here. Those are really fun. These are all free to use. You can also download them and use them on your computer, like if you're creating a Word document or a Photoshop like design of your site, you can actually use the fonts by downloading them. So I think that's pretty neat. And when we're styling text, I talked about this a little bit. There's some basics, one of them being the size. But we also have the family, which I just showed you how to define that. Style can be either italic or I actually think that's the only style. I don't remember what all the options were there. And then the font weight, if we're using Google Fonts, we actually have to put a number in here. If we look here at the different style options, you see how it'll have a number beside it, like extra light 200, light 300. Because I use Google Fonts, they have very specific different weights. This is what makes it look thicker or thinner. And so I would use a number, but if I'm using what's known as a built-in font, there are some just built into the browser. And we won't look at all of them, but if you want to know all your options, go ahead and click on some text, clear out the value, and you'll see a bunch of different things. These are all built in, and these are the ones that you could use without having to download anything. Actually, these aren't all of them. Because you could do something like Arial. And that's one I have installed on my computer, so it's going to show up. But it might not show up for people that don't have that font. So lots of options there. If I wanted to add font weight, I don't know, emoji, I guess, is an option. I'm going to do just sans serif. And I was not using a Google font, I would put something like bold or regular, and it would change. Oops, I guess it didn't like regular. Normal, sorry. And it would make it kind of a lighter weight. Or you see there's also some numbers in there. So you can use numbers, bold, or normal. That's for fonts. And then this is the big one I wanted to spend some time on because I think this is very confusing for some folks. You'll notice when I turned off my styles, everything was like jammed up to the left side of the page and all really close together. One of the biggest things we do when styling our HTML is add spacing around stuff just so it looks better. And there are three different ways to add spacing. There's padding, there's padding, there's a border, and there's a margin. If you think of it this way, the margin is going to push other things away from your element and create space around them, whereas padding is going to push inside your element. So a good example of that is here. I have a container, right? And you'll see when I highlight it, it actually uses different colors, which is really helpful. For our margin, which is above it, I remove that, which let's look at the nice version. It's gonna actually not do anything right now because we have a background above it. But if I remove the padding, the space between the edge of the container and the content changes. So I could also make this a lot bigger, a lot smaller. You can go negative when you're using margins, not so much with padding because you can't subtract from what's inside the element. But if I had, let's see, you see how it kind of made it move off to the side in a weird way. There are a lot of different things I can do here. And again, this has a shorthand. I could target one side of my div by saying padding left, one rem, or one, let's do pixels since we're doing that. Or I could target all 4 points, top, bottom, right, left. The way you can see how this works is it's got this little arrow where you can actually expand the shorthand and you can see the order that it puts it in. So it's always top, right, bottom, left. So if I wanted to control the spacing inside and make it unique to each quadrant, I could do 20 pixels top, 8 pixels right, 80 pixels bottom, 1 pic left. So that's kind of wacky. Thankfully, my text is centered, so it doesn't really make it weird. But if I uncentered that, you'd see it's a little odd how it spaced it out. So yeah, padding and margins are really important. A border, typically, we don't use this for spacing. That's usually used to actually add a physical border that you could see. But for something that does have a border, I think, like, let's say this button, I might have added one. Probably not, though. I don't think I did an example. If I scroll down, this is one of my other favorite tools of the inspector. There's this little box thing. The box model is what we call this. And it shows me exactly what the margins are for this element that I'm on, what the border is, which in this case, there's no border, what the padding is, and then what the actual size of the thing is. So the size of your element is without any padding or margin or anything. The rest of these are treated as separate attributes of that item. So pretty cool. This is very helpful when you're learning, I find, because it's sometimes hard to remember that the margin pushes out and that padding pushes in. I used to flip-flop those a lot when I was first learning, so I thought that would be helpful to see. And then there are also some display options. So we talked about in HTML, you have block elements and inline elements. The type of element it is controls often how it displays. And again, that's tied to that default browser CSS that we talked about. So inline elements, if these were each an inline element, they take up only the space they need, and they're going to just butt up right against each other. There's no extra spacing or anything around them. Whereas block elements are going to take out the fullest space available to them, and they're not going to be next to each other. But with CSS, we can change this. So if I wanted to say, I don't want this to be an inline element, which I think I already did that. I set it to display block. And again, we're going to use this list because I think this is a fun way to learn all the different options. If I display it as a block, it's on its own line. Let's go to one of these normal ones. If I display it as inline, you notice all the spacing around it on the top and bottom went away. That's because inline elements can't have padding or margins, or they can have padding, they can't have margins. Inline block allows me to add padding and margins, but not start this element on its own line. And then there's a bunch of other ones that we don't have time to get into. Display none is an important one. It does exactly what you would think it does, and it hides it. You probably won't use that until you get into JavaScript, because you can change styling with JavaScript. So that if I say I wanted this picture to disappear when the user clicked on it, I could totally do that. And then we've got table, which is really used for tables in HTML. But you can also display something else that isn't a table as if it was one. So a lot of cool options with display. This is crucial to styling, because there are a lot of times you're going to want to take something that's, say, an inline element and make it look like it's not, make it look like a block element. A good example of that, here on our mission page, I had a list, and typically list items are block elements that can have other things in them. So like if I wanted to change the spacing, which I did here to make that a little cleaner, I can do that very easily by setting it to display block, or if it's, say, our nav, setting it to display flex, which I have a slide in here about that. I wish we had more time to talk about it, but this is my favorite guide to Flexbox. And I focused on Flex because it's supported by most browsers, meaning it will work for any browser your user opens the site in, but it's also really good for making responsive sites. And I'm going to send you guys kind of my nice version of the site so you can experiment with it, because we don't have as much time as I'd hoped. But if you want to see what your site looks like on different devices, there's this cool thing built into the inspector. It says toggle device toolbar, which is going to allow you to adjust the size of the browser and kind of fake what it would look like on different things. So let's say I wanted to look at my site on an iPhone X. I select that, and it makes it the size that it would be on an iPhone. And you notice my site kind of restacked and things look really nice. This is because I'm using Flexbox, and I'm also using percentages to define the width of some of my stuff instead of pixel values. And I'm using something called media queries. And I don't think we'll have a lot of time to get into that based on right now, but you'll be able to see an example. I'm gonna pull up my good project here, and I'll send this to you guys with comments in it. So here, media queries are basically a way to say, all right, browser, you got your styles, but I want to swap some of them out if the screen is this size. And there are lots of powerful things you can do with media queries. So here I wanted to say, all right, when the screen is less than 780 pixels. So less than is always max width, but there's also a min width option. I encourage you to kind of Google this because there's a lot of different stuff you can do. But I want on a screen, when it's on a screen and it's less than 780 pixels, I want all of these styles to take effect. So these styles will only take effect if it's at this size. And let's say when it gets even smaller, I want to do more stuff to it. So at 520 pixels, these styles will take effect. And then 375, I went even smaller with that. So this allows us to target different device sizes so that our site looks good on all the things our users might open it on. And there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with this. It's, if you watch, everything should be pretty fluid and you don't see too many weird jumpy things. Again, a lot of that is because I'm using that flex box, display flex, and I'm also using percentages. So if you look at this intro block here, instead of putting like a width of, I don't know, 20 pixels, which is going to look like garbage, I put 100%. And that means that this will take up 100% of the width available. On our mission page, we've had this kind of layout where this was half the page and this was half. I did that by setting the container, which was a side, to width of 50%. And so that means that no matter how big the device is that I'm on, it will always take up 50% until I get down to a certain size, and then I set it to 100%. And so you can tell when media queries have taken effect because you'll see them here in the style editor. But you'll also see that your original width was crossed out. So now the new width that I'm applying is 100% because of that media query. So this is something that's a little more advanced, but I think any site that, you know, as developers that we're building today should be responsive, because that's better for accessibility and it's just better for everyone. Anyone can use our site. All right, I think we have one more thing here. Yes, pseudo elements. This is a list of extra kind of things that are added to an HTML element that we can't see. And they typically come before, this is one option, or after. And you'll see in the CSS I send you, there's an example of this where I wanted to add a line that showed up after my link. So you notice when I hover on these, let me turn this off. This little link appears, or little line appears, and it kind of goes across. And so what I did is I put on this after thing. You always have to set the content or it's not going to show up. There's some different properties that you can use on a pseudo element. And what it's going to do if I inspect this is, you see I've got my link here and there's a little arrow beside it now. Typically these arrows mean there's something else nested, right? In this case, our nested thing is our text and then this pseudo element right there after, which is my line. And so I set it so that it doesn't ever, it has a width of 0 right now. But if I hover over, if I put the cursor over my link, and I can also fake that by using this property here. You see it says hover, or this button. And if I click on hover, oops, on my link, it's now going to show me the styles for when someone hovers over this. So I went back to my pseudo element after, and you'll see that when the user hovers over this link, I want the width of that after element to become 100%. And that's why it looks like, I use an animation in there too, but that's why you suddenly see it on hover and you don't see it all the rest of the time. So pseudo elements are really great for doing that, as well as a few other things. But the other thing I'm making use of here, and you can see an example here, is focus and hover. These are what are called pseudo classes. So pseudo elements actually add something to your HTML. Pseudo classes actually just allow you to manipulate the styles in different ways. One of those ways is to say, okay, here's my element. So let's say it was my link in that example. And I want to make sure that the second child, so anything nested in that link, actually that's a bad example. Let's say my nav, I have a list item, right? And inside that list item, I might have a link, a header, a paragraph. In this example here, oops, where I'm saying nth child, if I had link, header, paragraph, the header is actually going to get those styles because it's the second child of the parent element. If I wanted to say target just the even children, and again, this is really great if you have a list or you have a div with a bunch of different stuff in it. Let's say this was an unordered list and I had 4 list items in it. Using nth child even, the even numbered children, even numbered list item in that unordered list would get those styles. And then these are also useful for the example I just showed you. If we're hovering over, so putting our cursor over an element, or it gets focus. Focus is what happens when I use my keyboard. See how it's moving around. I can control that styling by using this pseudo class hover and focus. These, in my mind, are crucial for your website because it's really hard sometimes for people to tell when something is interactive, when they can click it, or it's going to do something. And hover and focus states allow you to communicate that it is interactive in a way that people are familiar with. So pseudo elements add something to the actual HTML with styling, and pseudo classes manipulate the state of the HTML. So in this case, the even child or the hovered state. All right. So that was a lot, guys. And I know you're gonna have questions. I think CSS is probably way harder to wrap your head around than HTML because it's not as straightforward. It's a little more exciting and creative, I think, because there's just so much you can do. But you guys are really smart. I can just tell. And so I wanted to include some things in here for after the fact, because a lot of what we covered today is the bare bones, basic stuff, basic HTML, basic CSS. But most developers really don't do a lot of this anymore. I actually had to relearn how to do CSS for this talk because I don't use it. I use something that's related to CSS, but it's kind of an evolution of it where it's a lot more efficient and it's just got lots of cool bells and whistles. It's called Sass, and I'll link to that here at the end. But you have to kind of have these basic building blocks before you can get into those. And so I encourage you, I'm going to send you the rest of my site because I think it's really helpful to have an example that you can manipulate. And as I showed you, you could actually do that with any site in the browser. So I didn't get a chance to show y'all how to use Font Awesome, but I can include a guide. But when we're learning, being able to click on something on the page that you like and say, all right, how did they do it? So I'm looking at this div. I'm like, okay, they added a cool background image. That's dope. They added some margin properties with different values to kind of center it on the page. They changed the height. So you can see all the different things that are going on in the CSS by using this inspector. And I think that's really helpful when we're learning because it gives us examples of things that we want to know how to do, but it also is fun if we just want to like experiment and change the colors of things. We can do that. We can manipulate all of the styling and the HTML. So if I wanted to call this Bekah is awesome, I could totally do that. And so this allows us while we're working and we're building something to really experiment with it before we've actually saved our code. So if you've done something and you're like, ooh, I kind of think I want to do this instead, I often will do it in the browser just to make sure I like it and then go back to my code and just duplicate whatever I did. I think that's a great way to learn. It's also just a great way to kind of stretch the limits of what you can do with HTML and CSS. But once you guys have mastered that, these links in here, all helpful stuff. I included some things that are a little more advanced, and I encourage you, if you feel pretty confident with HTML and CSS, to take a look at these. They have lots of YouTube videos on their site, lots of documentation that explains what it is, how to use it. And if you have questions, always come to me. But if any of you are interested in doing this, especially as a career, it is important to kind of know some of the industry standards. One of those is using what's called a CSS preprocessor, Sass. Source control, GitHub, that's hopefully something y'all will learn in maybe one of the other sessions. One thing that sucks is if you have all your code locally on your computer, how do you get your teammates to be able to access it and work on it at the same time as you? Source control is what does that. It also allows you to keep different versions of your code. So if you change something, you're like, oh, I don't like that. I like what I had before. You can roll it back. It's very cool, but it is a little more advanced because it requires you to learn the commands and also use the command line. There are lots of tutorials on this. I think it'd be really great if y'all get a chance to check them out. All that being said, I hope that this was really helpful. I've been trying to be on Slack and kind of watch things. And if y'all have questions, please reach out. I'd also really love to see what you make. So I'm going to put the whole project with all the stuff I added in Slack. So y'all can download that, open it, check it out. And I want you to change it, or go ahead and start working on your site for this project. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And send me a screenshot or send me the files. I would love to see what you do. Nothing is too silly or like out there. Web development is a lot of fun. It's basically just another art form, just like painting or drawing. It just takes a little bit more of a learning, or has a little bit more of a learning curve. But I would love to see what you guys do, because to me, this is super exciting. The fact that you're in high school and learning this puts you way ahead of other folks. And you can do a lot of cool things with it. So I hope this was helpful, and it was good to see everyone again. And hopefully I'll talk to some of y'all soon.
Thank you, Bekah, so much for your time. We just really appreciate.
Happy to be here and look forward to seeing what everyone does at the end of this. I'm very, very cool, very excited. All right, I'll upload that stuff here in just a second. Also, I updated my slide deck, so if you downloaded it, you'll need to get it again, but you could also just pull it up in Google Presenter or whatever it's called, and look at it there. I included a lot of links because I knew that I wouldn't cover everything. So definitely check that out. Someone asked, which website do I start working from scratch? So we covered that in last week, how you actually like build out the files and the file structure and all that. So if you can watch the beginning of that recording, I think we covered it within the first 30 minutes. Go ahead and do that, and that will cover kind of how we got to where we are today. So what I sent you was a lot of what we worked on last week, kind of pre-done for you. And that's what I'm gonna do again today, but definitely go back and watch the video, and that'll show you how to start from the beginning.
Yeah, I just
Alrighty.
dropped into the chat a link that has all the workshop information, the recordings, what you need to download. So definitely check that out. And we'll try to edit this video today and have it out as soon as possible, maybe by tomorrow.
Awesome. Well, great, guys. It was really nice to meet everyone, and I look forward to seeing what you do. Have a good day. And happy
Thank
Halloween.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, happy Halloween.